Chapter 14 of The Slipper Point Mystery. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Slipper Point Mystery by Augusta Huiell Seaman. Chapter 14. The Real Buried Treasure. It had been a very dull day indeed for Genevieve. Had she been able to communicate her feelings adequately, she would have said she was heartily sick and tired of the program she had been obliged to follow. As she sat solitary on the porch of Miss Camilla's tiny abode, thumb in mouth and tugging at the lock of hair with her other hand, she thought it all over resentfully. Why should she be commanded to sit here all by herself in a spot that offered no attractions whatever, told, nay, commanded, not to move from the location, when she was bored beyond expression by the entire proceeding? True, they had left her eatables in generous quantities, but she had already disposed of these, and as for the picture books of many attractive descriptions, given her to while away the weary hours, they were an old story now, and the afternoon was growing late. She longed to go down to the shore and play in the rowboat, and dabble her bare toes in the water, and indulge in the eternally fascinating experiment of catching crabs with a piece of meat tied to a string in her father's old crab net. What was the use of living when one was doomed to drag out a wonderful afternoon on a tiny, hopelessly uninteresting porch out in the backwoods? Existence was nothing but a burden. True, the morning had not been without its pleasant moments. They had rowed up the river to their usual landing place, a trip she always enjoyed, though it had been marred by the fear that she might be again compelled to burrow into the earth like a mole, forsaking the glory of sunshine and sparkling water for the dismal dampness of that unspeakable hole in the ground. But, to her immense relief, this sacrifice was not required of her. Instead, they had made at once through the woods and across the fields to Miss Camilla's, albeit burdened with many strange and to her mind useless tools and other impedimenta. Miss Camilla's house offered attractions not a few, chiefly in the way of unlimited cookies and other eatables. But her enjoyment of the cookies was tempered by the fact that the whole party suddenly took it into their heads to proceed to the cellar and, what was even worse, to attempt again the loathsome undertaking of scrambling through the narrow place in the wall and the journey beyond. She herself accompanied them as far as the cellar, but further than that she refused to budge. So they left her in the cellar with a candle and a seat conveniently near a barrel of apples. It amazed her, moreover, that a person of Miss Camilla's years and sense should engage in this foolish escapade. She had learned to expect nothing better of Sally and Dawes, but that Miss Camilla herself should descend enthusiastically to so senseless a performance caused her somewhat of a shock. She had not expected it of Miss Camilla. It transpired, however, that they did not proceed far into the tunnel. She could hear them talking and exclaiming excitedly, and discussing whether this was really 27, and hadn't we better count again, and shall we saw it out, and other equally pointless remarks of a similar nature. Weary of listening to such idle chatter, and replete with cookies and russet apples, she had finally put her head down on the edge of the barrel and had fallen fast asleep. When she had awakened, it was to find them all back in the cellar, and Miss Camilla making the pleasant announcement that they would have luncheon now and get to work in earnest afterward. A soul-satisfying interval followed, the only real bright spot in the day for Genevieve. But gloom had settled down upon her once more when they had risen from the table. Solemnly they had taken her on their laps, at least Miss Camilla had, and ominously Sally had warned her. "Now, Genevieve, we've got something awfully important to do this afternoon. You don't like to go down in that dark place, so we've decided not to take you with us. You'd rather stay up here in the sunshine, wouldn't you?" And she had nodded vigorously, an unqualified assent to that proposition. "Well, then," Sally had continued, "you stay right on this porch or in the sitting room, and don't you dare venture a foot away from it. Will you promise?" Again Genevieve had nodded. "Nothing will hurt you if you mind what we say, and by we'll come back and show you something awfully nice." Genevieve had seriously doubted the possibility of this latter statement, but she was helpless in their hands. "And there's plenty of cookies and a glass of jam," Miss Camilla had supplemented. "And we'll come back to you soon, you blessed baby." And they had all hugged and kissed her and departed. Well, they had not kept their word. She had heard the little clock in the room within strike and strike and strike, sometimes just one bell-like tone, sometimes 2 and 3 and 4. She could not yet tell the time, but she knew enough about a clock to realize that this indicated the passing of the moments, and still there had been no sign of return on the part of the exploring three. Genevieve whimpered a little and wiped her eyes, sad to say, on her sleeve. Then she thrust her hand for the 40th time into the cookie jar, but it was empty. And then, in sheer boredom and despair, she put her head down on the arm of her chair, tucked her thumb into her mouth, and closed her eyes to shut out the tiresome scene before her. In this position she had remained what seemed a long, long time, and the clock had sounded another bell-like stroke, when she was suddenly aroused by a sound quite different. At first she did not give it much thought, but it came louder this time, and she sat up with a jerk. Was someone calling her? It was a strange, muffled sound, and it seemed as if it were like a voice trying to pronounce her name. Genevieve, Genevieve, was all she could distinguish. Did they want her, possibly to go down into that horrible cellar and hole? She went to the door giving on the cellar steps and listened. But though she stood there fully 5 minutes, she heard not so much as a breath. No, it could not be that. She would go outdoors again. But no sooner had she stepped onto the porch than she heard it again, fainter this time, but undeniable. Where could it come from? They had commanded her not to venture a step from the porch, but surely, if they were calling her, she ought to try and find them. So she stepped down from the veranda and ran around to the back of the house. This time she was rewarded. The sound came clearer and more forcefully. Genevieve! Genevieve! But where still could it come from? There was not a soul in sight. The garden, for it was Miss Camilla's vegetable garden, was absolutely deserted of human occupation. But Genevieve wisely decided to follow the sound, so she began to pick her way gingerly between the rows of beans, climbing on quite a forest of tall poles. It was when she had passed these that she came upon something that caused her a veritable shock. The ground in Miss Camilla's cucumber patch, for the space of 10 or 12 feet square, had sunk down into a strange hole, as if in a sudden earthquake. What did it all mean? And as Genevieve hesitated on its brink, she was startled almost out of her little shoes to hear her name called faintly and in a muffled voice from its depths. Genevieve! It was the voice of Doris, though she could not see the slightest vestige of her. Here I am, answered Genevieve quaveringly. What do you want, Doris? Oh, thank God, came the reply. Go get someone, quick! We're buried alive! It caved in! Hurry, baby! Who shall I get? Demanded Genevieve. And well she might ask, for as far as anyone knew, there was not a soul within a mile of them. Oh, I don't know, came the answering voice. Go find someone, anyone. We'll die here if you don't. Genevieve was not sure that she knew just what that last remark meant, but it evidently indicated something serious. All right, she responded. I will try. And she trotted off to the front of the house. Here, however, she stopped to consider. Where was she going to find anyone? She could not go back home. She did not know the way. She could not go back to the river. The way was full of pitfalls in the shape of thorny vines that scratched her face and tripped her feet. And besides, Sally had particularly warned her not to venture in that direction, ever. After all, the most likely place to find anyone was surely along the road, for she had, very rarely when sitting on Miss Camilla's porch, observed a wagon driven past. She would walk along the road and see if she could find anybody. Had Genevieve been older and with a little more understanding, she would have comprehended the desperate plight that had befallen her sister and Doris and Miss Camilla, and she would have lent wings to her feet and scurried to the nearest dwelling as fast as those feet would carry her. But she was scarcely more than a baby. The situation, though peculiar, did not strike her as so much a matter for haste as for patient waiting till the person required should happen along. As she didn't see anyone approaching in either direction, she decided to return to the house and keep a strict eye on the road. And so she returned, seated herself on the porch steps, tucked her thumb in her mouth, and waited. There was no further calling from the curious hole in the back garden, and nothing happened for a long, long time. Genevieve had just about decided to go back and inquire of Doris what else to do, when suddenly the afternoon stillness was broken by the chug-chug of a motor car and the honking of its horn. And before Genevieve could jump to her feet, a big automobile had come plowing down the sandy road and stopped right in front of the gate. Here's the place, called out the chauffeur, and jumping down, walked around to open the door at the side for its occupants to get out. A pleasant-looking man descended and gave his hand to the lady beside him, and to Genevieve's great astonishment, the lady proved to be none other than the mother of Dawes. "Well, where's everyone?" inquired the gentleman. "I don't see a soul but this wee tot sitting on the steps." "Why, there's Genevieve!" cried Mrs. Craig, who had seen the baby many times before. "How are you, dear? Where are the others? Inside?" "No," answered Genevieve. "In the garden. Doris, she said, 'Come, find some one.'" "Oh, they're in the garden, are they? Well, we'll go round there and give them a surprise, Henry. Doris will simply be bowled over to see her daddy here so unexpectedly. And I'm very anxious to meet this Miss Camilla she has talked so much about. Come and show us the way, Genevieve." The baby obediently took her hand and led her around to the back of the house, the gentleman following. "But I don't see anyone here," he exclaimed when they reached the back. "Aren't you mistaken, honey?" This to Genevieve. "No, they in big hole," she announced gravely. The remark aroused considerable surprise and amused curiosity. "Well, lead us to the big hole," commanded Mrs. Craig laughingly. "Big hole, indeed! I've been wondering what in the world Doris was up to lately, but I never dreamed she was excavating." Genevieve still gravely led the way through the forest of bean poles to the edge of the newly sunk depression. "What's all this?" suddenly demanded Mr. Craig. "It looks as if there's been a landslide here. Where are the others, little girl? They've probably forsaken this and gone elsewhere." But Genevieve was not to be moved from her original statement. "They in there," she insisted, pointing downward. "Doris called. She said, 'Go find some one.'" The baby's persistence was not to be questioned. Mr. Craig looked grave, and his wife grew pale and frightened. "Oh, Henry, what do you suppose can be the matter?" she quavered. "I do believe Genevieve is telling the truth." "There's something mighty queer about it," he answered hastily. "I can't understand how in the world it has come about, but if that child is right, there's been a landslide or a cave-in of some sort here, and Doris and the rest are caught in it. Good heavens! If that's so, we can't act too quickly." And he ran round to the front of the house, shouting to the chauffeur, who had remained in the car. "There's been an accident. Drive like mad to the nearest house and get men and ropes and spades, anything to help dig out some people from a cave-in." The car had shot down the road almost before he had ceased speaking, and he hurried back to the garden. The next hour was a period of indescribable suspense and terror to all concerned, all at least save Genevieve, who sat placidly on Mrs. Craig's lap. Mr. Craig had brought out a chair from Miss Camilla's kitchen, and, thumb in mouth, watched the men furiously hurling the soil in great shovelfuls from the curious hole. She could not understand why Mrs. Craig should sob softly at intervals under her breath, nor why the strange gentleman should pace back and forth so restlessly and give such sharp, hurried orders. And when he jumped into the hole with a startled exclamation and seized the end of a heavy plank, she wondered at the unnecessary excitement. It took the united efforts of every man present to move that plank, and when they had forced it aside, Mr. Craig stooped down with a smothered cry. And the next thing Genevieve knew, they had lifted out someone and laid her on the ground inert, lifeless, and so covered with dirt and sand as to be scarcely recognizable. But from the light golden hair, Genevieve knew it to be Doris. Before she knew where she was, Genevieve found herself cascaded from Mrs. Craig's lap, and that lady bending distractedly over the prostrate form. Again the men emerged from the pit, carrying between them another form which they laid beside Doris, and, with a howl of anguish, Genevieve recognized the red bronze pigtail of her sister Sally. By the time Miss Camilla had been extricated from the debris as lifeless and inert as the other two, the chauffeur had returned at mad speed from the village, bringing with him a doctor and many strange appliances for resuscitation. A pulmotor was put into immediate action, and another period of heartbreaking suspense ensued. It was Doris who first moaned her way back to life, and at the physician's orders was carried back into the house for further ministrations. Sally was the next to show signs of recovery, but over poor Miss Camilla they had to work hard and long, for in addition to having been almost smothered, her foot had been caught by the falling plank and badly injured. But she came back to consciousness at last, and her first words on opening her eyes were, "Do you think we can get that Spode dinner set out all right?" A remark which greatly bewildered Mr. Craig, who happened to be the only one to hear it. "But how on earth did you and Mother happen to be here, Father, just in the nick of time?" marveled Doris from the depths of several pillows with which she was propped up in bed. She had been detailing to her parents at great length the whole story of Sally and the cave and the tunnel, and Miss Camilla and the hazardous treasure hunt that had ended her adventure. And now it was her turn to be enlightened. "Well," returned her father, smiling whimsically, "it was a good deal like what they call the long arm of coincidence in story books, and yet it was very simple after all. I'd been disappointed so many times in my plans to get down here to see you and your mother, and at last the chance came, the other day, when I could make at least a flying trip. But I hadn't even time to let you know I was coming. I arrived at the hotel about lunch time and gave your mother the surprise of her life by walking in on her unexpectedly. But I was quite disgusted not to find you anywhere about. Your mother told me how you had gone off for the day with your bosom pal Sally to visit a mysterious Miss Camilla, and I suggested that we take the car and go to hunt you up. As she was agreeable to the excursion, we started forth, inquiring our way as we went. It was a merciful providence that got us there not a moment too soon. And if it hadn't been for that little cherubic Genevieve, we would have been many minutes too late. If it hadn't been that 2 or 3 old planks had been bent over you and protected you from the worst of the earth and debris on top, and also gave you a slight space for air, I don't believe any of you would have been alive now to tell the tale. So the next time you go treasure hunting, young lady, kindly allow your useless and insignificant dad to accompany you." And he gave her ear a playful tweak. "Daddy, it was awful, simply awful, when that old plank gave way and the earth came sliding down on us," she confided to him, snuggling down in the arm he had placed around her. "At first we didn't think it would amount to much, but more and more earth came pouring down, and then another plank loosened, and Miss Camilla lost her footing and fell, and we couldn't make our way out past it, either direction, and still the dirt poured in all around us, and Sally and I tried to struggle up through the top, but we couldn't make any progress, and at last that third plank bent over and shut us in so we couldn't budge, and Sally and Miss Camilla didn't answer when I spoke to them, and I knew they'd fainted, and I felt as if I was going to faint too. But I called and called Genevieve, and at last she answered me, and after that I didn't remember anything more." She shuddered and hid her face in her father's sleeve. It had been a very horrible experience. "Don't think of it any more, honey. It turned out all right in the end. Do you know that Sally is around as well as ever now, and came up to the hotel to inquire for you this evening? She's as strong as a little ox, that child." "But where is Miss Camilla?" suddenly inquired Doris. "She hurt her foot, didn't she?" "She certainly did, but she insisted on remaining in her own home, and Sally begged her mother to be allowed to stay also, with the undetachable Genevieve, of course, and take care of her and wait on her. So there they are, and there you will proceed in the automobile this afternoon, if you feel well enough to make the visit." "But what about the treasure?" demanded Doris, her eyes beginning to sparkle. "If you refer to the trunks and chests full of articles that Miss Camilla insisted that we continue to excavate from that interesting hole in her garden, you do well to speak of it as treasure," answered her father laughingly, "for besides some valuable old family silver and quite rare articles of antique jewelry, she had there a collection of china and porcelain that would send a specialist on that subject into an absolute spasm of joy. I really would not care to predict what it would be worth to anyone interested in the subject. And you can tell your friend Sally, of the adventurous spirit, that she's got Treasure Island licked a mile, to use a very inelegant expression, and right here on her own native territory, too. I take my hat off to both of you. You've done better than a couple of boys who'd been playing and hunting for pirates all their youthful days. Henceforth, when I yearn for blood-curdling adventures and hairbreadth escapes, I'll come to you two to lead the way." But under all his banter, Doris knew that her father was serious in the deep interest he entertained in her strange adventure and all that it had led to. End of chapter 14.